Welcome to the Conscious Community Podcast. Today we're speaking with Ann Watts about her book, The Collected Letters of Alan Watts, which she co-edited with her sister Joan. Unfortunately, Joan was not able to join us today. We wish her best, and we thank Ann for coming on the show. So hello, Ann.
Hello. I'm happy to meet you both and be here for this interview. Thank you.
So we've been talking a lot about your father's work and just this general subject lately, just not only because of the magazine, but I just feel like all of this philosophical work has become very relevant in today's world. Philosophy is a field of study that has been studying how beings think for so long. A lot of our conversations as we were getting ready for this interview were just about how timely and relevant this has become. And we wanted to ask you, how it feels that there is this renewed interest in your father's work and in Zen Buddhism and in philosophy.
Well, to be honest, I'm very excited about it. I think it's a wonderful thing because one of the things my sister and I got really clear about as we were working on these letters, and we've also known this for a while, but Alan's writings are so relevant to today. We're hearing from people, there are many websites, not websites, but Facebook sites that are fan sites for Alan, and I think there's like 4 or 5 at least. And these are international. And so Joan and I have been hearing from people from different countries who are in their teens who are discovering Alan Watts and feeling like his writing is making a real difference for them in their thinking and in their life experience. That always feels amazing to me. I'm thrilled that that's so. And I think that this book that we've done of the collected letters is for people who were not already familiar with Alan's work. They have the opportunity to become familiar with it. And for those who've been fans for a long time, they'll get to see the development of his thinking and his philosophies and the shifts that he moves through over time. And I think that's a really powerful thing to watch that. So one of the basic things I feel is Alan really was encouraging people to communicate, to connect, and to lighten up and enjoy life.
I was reading the book and I thought it was interesting. You could just see how he communicated with even his parents. He was talking about philosophy with them and how much like his work would be part of his life, which I thought was really interesting. And I also thought was just interesting, just reading it, is you think about the time period and he'll say things that I can't remember specifically, but I was like, oh, that is very much of that time period, the way someone would say it.
Right.
Just how different their worldview is and how I think the influence of people like him has really changed how we see the world.
Like a lot of the ways culture and society is viewing things now it's heavily influenced by that influence that came in during that time. Yeah, by that time and by philosophers like that. And you see how these ideas come from a person and then they spread. That was another thing I was marveling at, is that at the time that he was bringing this philosophy to America, that was a very small, rarefied group of people. That now these are, books that millions of people read and everything. But at that time, it was the general world view and the general mentality of your average American at that time this has been totally alien thought. Now it's, maybe not everybody is interested in Zen Buddhism, but just about everybody's heard of it. And at the time, it would have been relatively novel concepts.
Right. But the thing about Alan was that he was so engaging and people loved to listen to him. And of course, nowadays, there's all the stuff on YouTube. There's a lot of Alan on YouTube and places like that. And my brother Mark handles all of his videos and audio recordings and stuff like that. And so it's very accessible to hear the spoken word. And so that's also for people who don't have time to read or whatever, they have that connection. I think that Alan really did a great job of popularizing Asian thought and awareness for the Western mind. And so that was great. It's so funny. There's, on the back of the book, Stanley Krippner wrote a review of the book, and he says, Alan Watts once told me, in 50 years, nobody will remember me. To the contrary, his book books, essays, and recorded lectures have gained in stature in recent decades, etc. So
yeah,
I just love that. Alan had no concept of his impact really on the world. It's really pretty amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. I even had someone I know suggest, oh, you should talk to Alan Watts on your show because they think it's so relevant. They think that he's still alive.
Right.
Yeah. We were like, well, his daughter is the best we could do.
Well, he died in 1973, so that's a far reach. Yeah.
I actually, there's Eastern thought had made a first inroad into American thinking during the 19th century, and there was a whole range of ways that manifested. You had like secret societies that had these Egyptian rituals, and this was before we could decode hieroglyphics, so they were pretty much just making stuff up. And you had all the first translations of like Taoist writings and stuff in the 19th century, and it was inscrutable Asian thought, and they were really written in this kind of confusing, mysterious, these mysterious Asians kind of way, and was really inaccessible. And that's maybe one thing that Watts did so well, is that he put it in very plain English, and that I think one of the reasons a lot of people have a hard time with Zen or with Taoism is that they think it's complicated, and they think it's some complicated, obscure, esoteric, secret, when it's really very simple principles. And I think Watts was probably one of the first, if not the first, to put that in such simple language that was accessible. I know my first introduction to Taoism was that book, the Tao of Pooh.
Oh, right.
And that was after reading all these, various translations of the Tao Te Ching and never really quite grasping it. And I read that and it was like, oh, this is not really so complex. And I think that I don't know if that's necessarily a deliberate thing by people who don't want others to understand these concepts, or if it's just maybe like a fetishization of Asian culture to where it's, mysterious and, you can never really understand those mysteries. But I really appreciate that he made it so accessible, and it is really just such a simple thing that you can have in your everyday life.
Right. Voracious in his thirst for knowledge. And he had such an amazing grasp on the ideas and everything that he was learning. And he was so well able then to share it in a way that people really could get it. I have to say for myself, I found his books hard to read. I can't tell you the books that I like best because I haven't actually read them from cover to cover. I only recently read his autobiography cover to cover because of and it was actually easy reading once I got into it. What I did do was, as a child, I would hear him lecturing all the time. I was there in the background, and then later in life, listening to his videos and his audio talks, which I love listening to. I mean, I think I find that really easy to follow along in, and I delight in it. And I find that I must have along the way grokked a lot of what he was talking about, because it all feels like, yeah, that's how I think about things, right? It's like sort of by osmosis I got it growing up. But I think that what he talks about makes so much sense to people. And, in terms of, there are people who study Zen who really get into the discipline of that, the meditation and the depth of it. And so my grandmother was one of those, my mother's mother. And so there are people who get into it in that serious way, whereas my father got into it from the philosophical sense and the understanding sense without being a practitioner. And so there are different levels, right? And however, even though he wasn't a practitioner as such himself, he did meditate sometimes, but he wasn't like a serious everyday hours on end practitioner in that sense. So just sharing the philosophical thrust of it all was his way.
I was thinking just about the difference between audio and reading, and how the way information is transferred differently for the spoken word versus the written word. And do you think the way that ideas were communicated worked better vocally than they do in the written word? And do you think that is a reason why he's still relevant today, because we can listen to him versus just read his book?
Well, I think it's different for different people, right? It's really clear from working on this book of the collected letters that he loved to write. He wrote voluminously, and frequently in his letters he would apologize for the length of his letter, which I always thought was a hoot. But you know, he wrote close to 30 books, so he loved that writing. And for people there are a lot of people who love to read, and so that's really useful. On the other hand, I want to just say, and then there are people for whom listening, that's the way they take things in better. Also, in our day and age, a lot of people just don't have the time to read. So what do? Often they're driving a lot. They're in their cars. So they put in audio tapes and they listen to whoever it is that they want to be listening to. And a lot of Alan's work is available that way. And or they'll be doing other things around the house or whatever, and they'll be listening to Alan Watts. My sister tells a story about one time she brought some friends, I think it was on a Sunday, to a place in Stinson Beach. They had to buy something, and there was this store that was open in Stinson Beach. And this was years ago. And they walk up, and this woman is outside sweeping, and my sister could hear her father's voice booming out into the outdoors there because she was listening. I guess it was the KPFA Sunday morning Alan Watts show. And so there he was, right, as she brought her friend to the store. That was pretty funny. Yeah.
Well, podcasting has become really big. The reason why we decided to do it is I had some experience podcasting, and I had been wanting to do a spoken word podcast for a while, and this opportunity just kind of stumbled on me in a very serendipitous way. We've spoken to several authors who have said that podcasting is really where they're in the future going to be putting a lot of their effort. I know I'm always, one of my favorite thinkers right now is Sam Harris, and he is a neuroscientist who got into meditation and mindfulness. And when you listen to his podcast now, he sounds more and more and more like a Zen philosopher. And he's also a staunch atheist, and he is one of the most brilliant spiritual thinkers that I follow right now, but he doesn't see it that way. But the way I see it is that the stuff he's describing is exactly what the Zen masters are describing. Like he is thinking of it very rigidly and scientifically, and I kind of feel like, well, that's the point. Reality is what it is. But he's talked about how he's, podcasting is much more timely, that something can happen in the news or whatever, and he can respond to it instantaneously with a podcast, whereas if he was going to write a book about it, it would take him a year to make it, and by the time it was published, it wouldn't be as relevant. And Rabbi Rami, who we just interviewed, said the same thing, that he's written 30-something books, and at this point, most of his energy is going to be put into podcasting for the same reason. The other nice thing about podcasts is that, unlike a lot of other internet mediums, it's easily monetizable. So it's very easy to put commercial breaks in, or to have a sponsor in a world where it's very difficult to justify or show what the return of investment is for like a web advertisement. A podcast is something very concrete. Podcasts have a long shelf life. So if you have a bank of 100 episodes, you'll get a new listener, and they'll go through and they'll listen to all your 100 episodes, even the ones that are 5 years old. So if you're an advertiser and you bought an ad 2013, people are still going to be hearing your ad 10 years later, which, if you bought an ad in the newspaper, that's once that issue's done, people throw it away. So I see a lot of value in podcasting, and I was actually going to suggest, if he's got this huge store of these spoken lectures, if you were interested, it would be I would love to hear an Alan Watts podcast. You could, take different lectures.
Do you have an Alan Watts podcast? I know the videos are on YouTube. That's where I've seen them. Yeah,
I was thinking, you could take his old lectures, do a little commentary at the beginning on what this lecture is about. about, and then just have one of his lectures put out, a different lecture every week. I think there would definitely be an audience for that, because those people who are sitting in the car in traffic or whatever, podcasting has really become the go-to. And unlike the radio where you kind of listen to what's on when it's on, you can listen to a hour-long podcast, and your half-hour commute, you listen to the first half, and then a half-hour back, you listen to the second half. I just think it'd be great to hear his lectures in that format. I know I'd be able to go through a lot of them if I could get them on my Stitcher app.
Well, I will mention it to my brother Mark Watts, because he's the curator of all the audio property of our father. So I'll mention it to him. It sounds like a really cool idea. I like it.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah.
And this stuff is really just so relevant. One of the things that I found so interesting since I've been working on this magazine is that philosophy was this kind of throwaway subject. I can't tell you how many professors or bosses or friends over the years have, when you mention philosophy, they talk about it like, oh, you might take a philosophy or class or two in college, but you don't want to major in philosophy. There's no jobs in that. But over the last 6 months, I've just seen it become immensely central. And I listen to, dozens of different podcasts, and they're on all these different subjects, but they're all converging on the same central study and search for understanding of consciousness that Sam Harris's podcast, but his podcast is very scientific based, but he's grasping at consciousness and what is consciousness, and neuroscience is grasping at that, and computer science is grasping at that, and physics is grasping at that, and all these disciplines that are hard disciplines that people thought were worth studying and you could get a job, they're all stumbling towards philosophy now, and philosophy has all of a sudden become central, extremely relevant, extremely important. I think it's really important and valuable that, like, his lectures, he was ahead of his time and he dissected these things so thoroughly that, all those computer scientists and engineers and physicists and whatnot should be going back and listening to Watts's lectures. I think that would help move things along in the right direction as far as, all the work that needs to be done. Because it really is, it's become a matter of, human survival at this point, that we need to learn and grow as a species. And when it comes to everything from climate change to ecological collapse and all these challenges humanity is facing, I kind of think that this type of thought is really the solution to a lot of it.
Right. Alan was very, one of the things he would talk about is how connected we all are. We're all connected. Everything's connected, whether it's the ocean or the sky or the human beings or the animals or the plant life or all of that it's all completely interconnected. And so part of that is how important it is for us to take care of it all, to take care of our planet, to treat it with respect. He was also very interested in science, and as all these new scientific things were coming forth, he really got into it. He was just fascinated by that whole connection. Somebody like Sam Harris taking the science and then this philosophical aspect and putting them together. I think that's a very powerful thing. Alan would be right on board with that.
It's interesting. We're speaking with Ken Wilber tomorrow, and that's kind of his philosophy, and he mentioned Alan's work in the book I was reading. So interesting how we're all becoming, the integrated ideas are coming together.
Well, this is kind of what I was thinking about with how small a world it would have been in his day, that he would have had, correspondence with and a relationship with scientists and artists, and it would have been like the world was a smaller place then. There weren't nearly as many people, and there weren't nearly as many experts in those fields. He had a direct relationship with some of those physicists and scientists and philosophers and artists, in that day. I kind of feel like somewhere throughout the 60s and the 70s, things kind of went a little sideways, and there was all this progress in advancing human consciousness, and I feel kind of got lost. Like the 60s got off into this counterculture movement and just went really dark there at some point. Society got really chaotic, and probably at no more time up until now has society been so fragmented and kind of on the verge of collapse. it's kind of like we're starting to get back to what was being done, what was being worked on back in the 50s and the 60s, and now there's this resurgence of interest in that. I'm concerned that we don't get off the track again. I was curious, I did want to ask you on that subject, like, what do you think it is that happened that things could have been going so well and then went so bad, and why did we as a society lose the impetus to pursue this kind of thought for so long, and why does it have to have a resurgence? Why did we lose touch with it for so long?
Well, there's one aspect of it which I think is the pendulum of life, right? Things swing in one direction and then they swing in another direction. And, we're seeing that politically. And it's kind of, if you go back through history, what we see is that we keep repeating the same patterns over and over. And it's like, again, it's that pendulum swing from one to another. And so I think that was a part of it. My father worked with Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, who then became Ram Dass, and did studies with them with LSD and mescaline. They were at Harvard University at the time. He was fascinated by how something like that would affect the brain. He would take LSD or mescaline and he would record his experience on a tape recorder and he would send it to them so that they could really follow what his experience was. For him, it was like a religious thing. It was sacred. And I think a lot of people got a hold of drugs and just got into the high of it. And so people were just getting high willy-nilly. That was alarming to Ellen. The other thing is, one of the letters that he wrote about several times, actually, more than one letter, against making LSD and marijuana and mescaline, those kinds of drugs, illegal, because he said, you do that and it's going to be a mess. It will go underground and there will be no way to evaluate the quality of the drugs that people are taking, and they'll get mixed with other things and it'll be dangerous. It's not a good idea. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened, because they weren't going to listen to Alan Watts, of course. Instead, they went ahead with their decision to make it illegal, and of course it went underground. It's the same thing when they made alcohol illegal. The very same thing happened. It went underground and there was no quality control. That's a cautionary tale. But I think the other thing is his honoring and respecting the mind-altering drug that he was experimenting with. He treated it with respect. And I think what happened is that people stopped doing that, and then they got themselves into trouble.
Yeah, it is interesting to me that in the past few years, there has been a resurgence of research, serious medical research, into the use of hallucinogens, MDMA and LSD in particular, in treatment of a wide range of psychiatric problems, from alcoholism to PTSD and depression and anxiety. It's been since his day that it's been illegal, not studied academically in any real sense. And I don't think it's a coincidence. I think the insights of this philosophy and the kind of changes in the mentality that it represented was threatening to the status quo, and that one of the reasons that these drugs were made illegal was because they were afraid of the destabilizing effect of this kind of change in mentality. And I think what we ended up with is, a 40-year period of, we had the drug war and it's just gotten worse and worse and worse.
Right.
And we had this drift away and this loss of connection to all that progress that was made. Ultimately, and this has been my argument for the past year, the people who wanted to keep a lid on society waking up are the people now crying and rending their hair over the rise of Trump. And that when I look at Trump, what I say is, if you dumb down society deliberately to keep a lid on society's consciousness evolving, Trump is the natural logical consequence of that. And that when you have someone like that that with their finger on the button, you have endangered all of humanity because you wanted to keep us safe from our own spiritual growth. Like
right.
it's really, there's this desperate back scrabble in those same circles. There's this desperate okay, well, maybe we do need to look at philosophy. Maybe we do need to look at Buddhism, or all of a sudden it has become immensely relevant. That's kind of where I see our work, and where I see Sam Harris's work and all these other people who are talking about this, like mindfulness and whatnot, is that we've got 40 years of catching up to do all of a sudden, and it saddens me to think where we would be now if we hadn't had 40 years of backsliding.
Right. And, that was another one of my father's points, was that scientific research into how these drugs could help people who were having psychological difficulties of one kind and another was a really important thing to continue. And by making it illegal, of course, it didn't. And and we are definitely suffering from the effects of making it illegal, and the amount of crime that engenders. It's just crazy. You're right about the suppression of education that goes along with that, and that desire to have people be dumbed down so that they'll do what people want them to do, and they'll believe anything because they're not thinking. They don't know how to think, and so they'll do just whatever they're told, and whoever has the biggest money. And I actually think that greed is the thing that's behind it all.
Oh, definitely.
Right? The more money that I can make, then I will have you do whatever it takes to do what I want you to do so that I can have more.
Oh, particularly, with the drug issues, if they could treat psychological conditions and get rid of them. For example, I've read research that they say they can do that in a clinical environment with LSD. People wouldn't be taking benzodiazepines and numbing themselves out, which is an epidemic right now.
And one phenomena I've observed is I call it drinking your own Kool-Aid, where that you have a society that is so broadly dumbed down that the people who are rising up and attaining power are also dumbed down. That at the time when they embarked on, and it was most definitely a deliberate process, at the time when they embarked on the process of putting a lid on all this, the people putting a lid on it were smart folks. But now they are, second or third generation inheritors of that privileged status. They're not very bright themselves. Generally speaking, they have power, but you look at Trump, he's blissfully unaware. He has the power. He's benefiting from the dumbed down society, but he's not bright himself. It's there's a comedy, Idiocracy, that it reminds me of. That's where the president of the country is a pro wrestler, and it's really like that's where it gets into a danger to humanity and the earth itself, is like at the point when even the elites aren't enlightened. That it's one thing to have a flock of sheep that are led around that buy whatever car you tell them to buy or whatever, but that even the elites drink the Kool-Aid. They're dumb too. They don't understand that they don't have to have that car. They don't have to have that thing. They believe their own marketing.
Right. Well, it's a disease in its own way. I used to lead financial workshops with Spencer Sherman, who's a well-known financial guru type person, and he said that he would have these clients and he'd say, okay, how much do you want to make? And they would tell him, and then when they got there, he'd say, okay, we're here, and they were like, no, I've got to double that. And this would just go on and on and on because it's never enough. And the more people make, the more they spend. And so they're just it becomes this it's cyclical problem, that they can't get out of it. They start, they're hiring all these people, and then they're responsible for all these people, and now I've got to have more cars, and I've got to have more diamonds, and I've got to have the biggest yacht in the neighborhood, and all this kind of craziness. It's like an addiction.
No, absolutely. Well, there's the biblical quote, "The love of money is the root of all evil."
Right.
That's definitely true. One thing about the book I wanted to ask you is, what brought you and your sister the idea to compile this book now? Was there something that spurred you on to do so?
In 1993, I think it was, our stepmother, Jano, died, and she had all of Alan's papers in boxes, some of which had been rain damaged in storage. But my sister and I, Joan and I are the two eldest children of Alan out of 7, and we're the holders of the literary works, basically. So we got all the papers, all the letters, all the tax info, and the this and the that. My sister went through all that stuff because I was on the East Coast and she was on the West Coast when we inherited those. She took over that part of it. She discovered all these letters. Alan kept carbon copies of all the letters he wrote. And then we think that when he did his autobiography, that his parents, who had kept every letter he ever wrote, must have sent him those letters. And so they're all those original letters. And, Joan had them in a couple of file cabinets in her office and for like 20 some years. And then when she retired, she was at that time running a bed and breakfast for fishermen in Montana. And she retired from that. And she was out here in California, and we were at New World Library talking to the chief editor there, Jason Gardner. They were republishing books of Alan's that had gone out of print. So we were there talking to him about that. And then Joan mentioned that she had this collection of letters, and he just lit up. We decided that we would edit those letters ourselves, and that's how it all happened.
Wow, that's quite the undertaking. So
right.
How many letters? Do you have an idea how many total there were? Or
I don't. There were hundreds of letters. And Jason Gardner's idea was that we would come up with a 300-page book. As we went through the letters, there were so many that we felt that we couldn't delete. We deleted what we could and what we thought wasn't really relevant. We came up with a 600-page book. When he looked at that, he said, "Oh, we're going to have to cut some stuff." And Joan said, "Well, good luck."
Yeah. Did he?
And the truth was, he really couldn't. He got it. He saw what we were seeing. Mm-hmm. And so the book was published, and I just want to say beautifully so. I think they did a really beautiful job in the printing and the cover and all of it. I think they did a beautiful job with this book. So we're very happy about it.
I was going to say, what were some of your best or your favorite correspondences? What particular people that he was talking to did you find the most interesting?
There's a lot. And, some of the philosophical, and, one of the things is that he was a Episcopalian priest for a period in his life. And so that was an interesting journey. But, I loved things like, I loved some of the letters he wrote as a 13-year-old when he went to boarding school and wrote to his parents. And one of them was, so he was going to this Church of England school. He wrote a letter about that. Joan and I just loved. Would you like me to read just a little piece of that?
Sure.
This is in December 2nd, 1928, so he's 13 years old. He says, "Dear Mommy and Daddy, thank you for your last letter. I have got crowds of news for you this week. I shall see the enthronement of the Archbishop all right. Another boy and myself have got to carry his train," in caps. "We have got to dress up in all sorts of complicated affairs. We've got to wear ruffs and red cassocks. I have been to several rehearsals for the service, and it is going to be a very pompous affair. The Premier and the Lord Chancellor are going to be there, and the Lord Mayor of London. We have got to go to the Archbee's palace and wait in the hall till he comes, then pick up his train and follow him." And in the book, we have a photograph of this event that was in the newspaper. And so I just love it. I think it's really dear. In another letter he wrote to his father for his birthday, and he did a drawing, he said, as a gift to his father for his birthday. He said, I think it's a shame you should have a procession on your birthday. And so he did a drawing of rabbits in a parade, and one of them's on the litter, and the one on the litter was a drawing of his favorite pet rabbit, Oberon, who he called Obi. And and so it's just delightful drawing, and that drawing is in the book. He actually thought that he would be an artist rather than a writer, really. And then I loved the letters where he describes the countryside, because he describes it in a way that it's just, you're right there with him. It's like a painting, and you can see it with him, and then later letters that he wrote on behalf of Native Americans, for instance, things like that. Those are some of my most favorite letters.
One thing you said there was he thought he would be an artist. I just think it's interesting when you think about art as a way, it's like a way you work out philosophical ideas. So that how art and philosophy are just so related.
Yeah, that's one of the things we talked to a gentleman who's an artist on one of our podcasts. And that's one of the things that I was trying to draw out with him, is that people sometimes don't understand that in the arts you are playing with ideas and concepts and the interplay of ideas in this visual medium, but oftentimes I was trying to explain how this related to our mission here at the magazine. We're a metaphysical magazine, and people might not necessarily see the connection between visual art and philosophy, but that to almost any there are visual artists who aren't as philosophical, but to almost any visual artist that connection is obvious, and that showing that connection to people who maybe aren't familiar with the visual arts world is part of explaining to the general audience, here's another place that this is being laid out.
Yeah, I think that what art is, you're taking non-concrete thoughts and you're turning it into something concrete. So it's a way to work out these philosophical ideas, such as with writing as well. So it seemed that, do you know what made him change his mind to do oratory and written work versus visual work?
I don't know that it was a change of mind. I think it's just that he started writing, and he started writing at a very young age. The first booklet that he wrote was when he was 15 years old. He had been in a library or a store where he found a pamphlet for the London Buddhist Society, and so he started engaging with them, and at some point he sent them his pamphlet that he had written, and they were so impressed they invited him to come and talk to them. And of course they were expecting a much older person, and they were stunned when this 15-year-old walked in. Right. So he had the gift for writing at a very young age, and so I think that just morphed into, that was the lead thing that he was doing. He never stopped his interest in art, and another thing that flowed from that was his interest in calligraphy, learning Chinese and how to make the characters with the brush and the ink. He just loved it.
I just had a thought. Do you think, I don't know if he ever would have talked to you about this, but is there a relationship between the characters and the concept? Well, I know that they come from the ideas that you're saying, but do you think that's a reason why that, as Spencer said earlier, that Westerners sometimes have a hard time grasping Eastern ideas, is because they have more of a visual way of thinking than we do?
Right. Yeah, and he was very into that. And in fact, I used to teach the deaf, and he said, what would really be expedient would be to teach the deaf to read Chinese, because it's a pictorial language, and it's already written, rather than creating a whole new language, a whole new alphabet and all of that for the deaf. Give them something that is already a voluminous library of characters that they could use. But of course, there's always this kind of distrust of, this is some Asian thing and it's not us, so that's not really going to fly. But I thought it was a brilliant idea.
Yeah, that is. I like that idea.
Yeah. The concept's attached to the character, not attached to the sounds.
Right.
So the sound is divorced from the meaning and the visual character. The thought into the thought behind Taoism and behind Buddhism, behind Zen. It was very rigorous, one would almost say scientific process of examination and thought experiment that led them to the conclusion that they have.
Right, and they had a very rich culture. Interestingly, I don't know if you know of Chenglian Al Huang, who partnered with my father. He's a master Chinese Tai Chi teacher, and he and my father partnered and gave a lot of seminars seminars together, and he actually finished the last work that my father was working on, Tao, the Watercourse Way. He has been working with a professor in China, and there is now an offer on the table to translate Alan's books into Chinese.
Oh, that's interesting. It's like a full circle thing.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah. I think it's incredible. Yeah. So hopefully there will be a whole new market, a whole new people who are in China taking in the philosophies and the work of Alan in a way that is moving for them as well.
Yeah, well, you have a tragedy there where the Cultural Revolution, I studied traditional Chinese martial arts, and the story in our school was that basically the Cultural Revolution came through and stomped a lot of this stuff out as superstition.
Right. It's pretty exciting. Yeah. You were talking about the connection between philosophy and art. And I have to say that for Alan, he loved drawing and painting. He loved to dance. He loved to sing, and he was a gourmet cook. So all of those things made up the whole, right, of that voraciousness for life in all its aspects, I think.
We're coming to the end of our interview. I wanted to ask you: are there any other projects you'd like to share with our listeners?
There are a couple of things I'd love. First of all, there is another new book that has just come out. It's titled Zen Odyssey, the story of Sokyan, Ruth Fuller Sasaki, and the birth of Zen in America. It's written by Janica Anderson and Stephen Schwartz, and it's published by Wisdom. And this story completely interweaves with the collected letters. Ruth Fuller Sasaki is my mother's mother. And it's her journey into becoming a Zen priest, which she was the first foreigner and the first woman accepted into the Zen priesthood in Japan. And she had a temple at Daitokuji in Kyoto, and that temple is still there, and her photograph's still on the altar there. And it's the story of Sokyan, who was sent by his teacher to bring Zen to America, and his journey, and when the two of them meet, form a relationship that eventually turned into a romantic relationship. Together, they formed the first Zen Institute in America. We have a letter in our book that Alan wrote to Sokyan when he was 17 years old, little knowing that this man would become his stepfather-in-law. Wow. So, and then if people are interested in knowing more about me and the work I do, they can go to my personal website, which is Anne Watts, WATTS.com. And I certainly intend to, at some point, add this podcast to my own webpage. And then I work for a group called the Human Awareness Institute, which, just the title of the institute really kind of feels like a lot of what we've been talking about here, awareness. They have a new website coming up soon. It's not up yet, but it's HAI.org, Human Awareness Institute, HAI.org. And that talks about the bulk of the work that I do. And then the other last thing I would just mention is that one of the things that I never imagined that I would be doing, but I am doing, is teaching at Esalen. Every year I produce a workshop, a 5-day workshop called Reclaiming Your Authentic Self, which is basically a very deep healing the inner child workshop. And that's all based on work that I had to do for myself. So those are the things I would like people to know about. I've definitely enjoyed, this has been a very interesting interview, and I really appreciate your bringing me on for this. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for coming on. I hope your sister feels better. Heard she was under the weather.
Yeah, she got a bad flu. She was just out here, and she went home really, really sick. So she is improving, but it's not been fun.
Thank you very much for coming on. I really enjoyed the conversation, and we will be back in touch and let you know when everything comes out. And
the book, Zen Odyssey, sounds fascinating. We'll be looking for that one too.
Yeah, it definitely is. If you go on the Wisdom website, you'll find that they have 2 books titled Zen Odyssey, so that's why it's important to know that it's the one by Janica Anderson. And it's a fascinating book. It's an easy read. It's because she's written it in story form because she really wants it made into a movie. Just because Ruth is such an amazing female figure who's done such amazing things in the world. So, and throughout the collected letters, you see the ongoing relationship between Ellen and Ruth, which is really quite interesting. It was a challenging relationship for the two of them because she was such a serious student by the book. She just didn't understand Alan's popularity, and it was pretty interesting. And because he wasn't a serious student, she kind of poo-pooed him. But the truth was, he was brilliant, and I think he did a brilliant job at bringing the thoughts of Zen Buddhism to the masses.
I mean, if you really want to popularize something with the American public, you got to make a movie out of it. So I don't think that's a bad idea.
Right. It'll be great. Yeah. I hope she succeeds.
Inspire people to be interested in subject.
Yeah. Really. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye.
You too. All right. Bye for now.
Thank you for joining us for the Conscious Community Podcast. If you'd like more information about sponsoring this podcast or advertising with Conscious Community Magazine, in print or online, please email me at spencer@consciouscommunitymagazine.com. That's SPENCER, or call 630-492-0831.